Welcome back to the Story Place. I'm so glad you came back because I have some different stories, of course. Some of them are quite old, like the one I'm going to read first, and some of them I think you know already, but I think you'd like to see the drawings, and there's some very lovely drawings in this book. So, our first story is Madeline. It was written in 1939 by Ludwig Bemelmans. In an old house in Paris that in two straight lines. In two straight lines, they broke their bread and brushed their teeth and went to bed. They smiled at the good and frowned at the bad, and sometimes they were very sad. They left the house at 9:30 in two straight lines, in rain or shine. The smallest one was Madeline. She was not afraid of mice. She loved winter, snow, and ice. To the tiger in the zoo, Madeline just said, poo-poo. And nobody knew so well how to frighten Miss Clavel. She was there in charge of them. In the middle of one night, Miss Clavel turned on the light and said, "Something is not right." Little Madeline sat in bed, cried and cried. Her eyes were red. And soon after Dr. Cohn came, he rushed out to the phone and he dialed DAN ton 10-6. "Nurse," he said, "it's an appendix." Everybody had to cry. Not a single eye was dry. Madeline was in his arm, in a blanket safe and warm. In a car with a red light, they drove out into the night. Madeline woke up 2 hours later in a room with flowers. Madeline soon drank and ate. On her bed, there was a crank. Outside were birds, trees, and sky, and so 10 days passed quickly by. One nice morning, Miss Clavel said, "Isn't this a fine day to visit Madeline?" Visitors from 2 to 4 read a sign outside her door. Tiptoeing with solemn face, with some flowers and a vase, in they walked and then said, "Ah," when they saw the toys and candy and the dollhouse from Papa. But the biggest surprise by far, on her stomach was a scar. "Goodbye," they said, "we'll come again." And the little girls left in the rain. They went home and broke their bread, brushed their teeth, and went to bed. In the middle of the night, Miss Clavel turned on the light and said, "Something is not right." And afraid of a disaster, Miss Clavel ran fast and faster. And she said, "Please, children, do tell me what's troubling you." And all the little girls cried, "Boo-hoo-hoo, we want to have our appendix out too." "Good night, little girls. Thank the Lord you are well. And now go to sleep," said Miss Clavel. And she turned out the light and closed the door. And that's all there is. There isn't any more. Now here's another one that you've probably heard, but I think you might find the illustrations interesting. This is written by Margaret Wise Brown in 1947, also a very old story. In the great green room, there was a telephone and a red balloon and a picture of the cow jumping over the moon, and there were 3 little bears sitting on chairs, and 2 little kittens and a pair of mittens, and a little toy house, and a young mouse, and a comb and a brush, and a bowl full of mush. I guess somebody hadn't finished it. And a quiet old lady who was whispering, "Hush." "Good night, moon. Good night, cow jumping over the moon. Good night, room. Good night, light and the red balloon. Good night, bears. Good night, chairs. Good night, kittens, and goodbye, mittens. Goodbye, clocks, and good night, socks. Good night, little house, and good night, mouse. Good night, comb, and good night, brush. Good night, nobody. Good night, mush. And good night to the old lady whispering, "Hush." Good night, stars. Good night, air. Good night, noises everywhere. This next story, it's a little newer, published in 1970, written and illustrated by Arnold Lobel. And it's from the story Frog and Toad Are Friends. It's a story about supporting your friends when they're sad. Toad was sitting on his front porch. Frog came along and said, "What's the matter, Toad? You're looking sad." "Yes," said Toad, "this is my sad time of day. It is the time when I wait for the mail to come. It always makes me very unhappy." "Well, why is that?" asked Frog. "Because I never get any mail," said Toad. "Not ever?" asked Frog. "No, never. No one has ever sent me a letter. Every day my mailbox is empty. That is why waiting for the mail is a sad time for me." Frog and Toad sat on the porch, feeling sad together. Then Frog said, "I have to go home now, Toad. There is something that I must do." Frog hurried home. He found a pencil and a piece of paper. He wrote on the paper, he put the paper in an envelope, and on the envelope he wrote, "A letter for Toad." Frog ran out of his house. He saw a snail that he knew. "Snail," said Frog, "please take this letter to Toad's house and put it in his mailbox." "Oh, sure," said the snail, "right away." It doesn't make much sense, does it, children? Then Frog ran back to Toad's house. Toad was in bed taking a nap. "Toad," said Frog, "I think you should get up and wait for the mail some more." "No," said Toad, "I am tired of waiting for the mail." Frog looked out of the window at Toad's mailbox. The snail was not there yet. "Toad," said Frog, "you never know when someone may send you a letter." No, I do not think anyone will ever send me a letter." Frog looked out of the window. The snail was not there yet. "But Toad," said Frog, "someone may send you a letter today." "Don't be silly. No one has ever sent me a letter before, and no one will send me a letter today." Frog looked out of the window. The snail was still not there. "Frog, why do you keep looking out of the window?" asked Toad. "Because now I am waiting for the mail," said Frog. "But there will not be any." "Oh, yes, there will," said Frog, "because I have sent you a letter." "You have?" said Toad. "What did you write in the letter?" Frog said, "I wrote, 'Dear Toad, I am glad that you are my best friend. Your best friend, Frog.'" "Oh," said Toad, "that makes a very good letter." Then Frog and Toad went out onto the front porch to wait for the mail. They sat there feeling happy together. Frog and Toad waited a long time. 4 days later, the snail got to Toad's house and gave him the letter from Frog. Toad was very pleased to have it. Now, this next story is from 1941. It takes place in Boston, and I wonder if you can guess the title, because you probably know this story. Mr. and Mrs. Mallard were looking for a place to live. But every time Mr. Mallard saw what looked like a nice place, Mrs. Mallard said it was no good. There were sure to be foxes in the woods or turtles in the water, and she was not going to raise a family where there might be foxes or turtles. So they flew on and on. When they got to Boston, they felt too tired to fly any further. There was a nice pond in the public garden with a little island on it. "The very place to spend the night," quacked Mr. Mallard. So down they flapped. Next morning they fished for their breakfast in the mud at the bottom of the pond, but they didn't find much. Just as they were getting ready to start on their way, a strange, enormous bird came by. It was pushing a boat full of people, and there was a man sitting on its back. "Good morning," quacked Mr. Mallard, being polite. The big bird was too proud to answer, but the people on the boat threw peanuts into the water, so the Mallards followed them all around the pond and got another breakfast better than the first. Well, you know that's the Swan boat. There you see it. I like this place, said Mrs. Mallard as they climbed out on the bank and waddled along. Why don't we build a nest and raise our ducklings right in this pond? There are no foxes, no turtles, and the people feed us peanuts. What could be better? Good, said Mr. Mallard, delighted that at last Mrs. Mallard had found a place that suited her. But, look out, squawked Mrs. Mallard, all of a dither. You'll get run over. And when she got her breath, she added, this is no place for babies with all those horrid things rushing about. We'll have to look somewhere else. So they flew over Beacon Hill and around the State House, but there was no place there. They looked in Louisburg Square, but there was no water to swim in. Then they flew over the Charles River. This is better, quacked Mr. Mallard. That island looks like a nice quiet place, and it's only a little way from the public garden. Yes, said Mrs. Mallard, remembering the peanuts. That looks like just the right place to hatch ducklings. So they chose a cozy spot among the bushes near the water and settled down to build their nest. And only just in time, for now they were beginning to molt. All their old wing feathers started to drop out, and they would not be able to fly again until the new ones grew in. That's what happens to birds in the spring when it starts to get warm. But of course they could swim, and one day they swam over to the park on the riverbank, and there they met a policeman called Michael. Michael fed them peanuts, and after that the Mallards called on Michael every day. After Mrs. Mallard had laid 8 eggs in the nest, she couldn't go to visit Michael anymore because she had to sit on the eggs to keep them warm. She moved off the nest only to get a drink of water or to have her lunch or to count the eggs and make sure they were all there. One day the ducklings hatched out. First came Jack, then Cack, then Lack, and then Mack and Knack and Whack, Pack and Quack. Mr. and Mrs. Mallard were bursting with pride. It was a great responsibility to take care of so many ducklings, and it kept them very busy. One day, Mr. Mallard decided he'd like to take a trip to see what the rest of the river was like further on. So off he set. I'll meet you in a week in the public garden, he quacked over his shoulder. Take good care of the ducklings. Don't you worry, said Mrs. Mallard. I know all about bringing up children. And she did. She taught them how to swim and dive. She taught them to walk in a line, to come when they were called, and to keep a safe distance from bikes and scooters and other things with wheels. Excuse me, children. When at last she felt perfectly satisfied with them, she said one morning, "Come along, children, follow me." Before you could wink an eyelash, Jack, Cack, Lack, Mack, Knack, Whack, Pack, and Quack fell into line just as they had been taught. Mrs. Mallard led the way into the water, and they swam behind her to the opposite bank. Boy, children, look at those cars from 1941. They must have used up a lot of gas. Look how big and heavy they are. There they waded ashore and waddled along until they came to the highway. Mrs. Mallard stepped out to cross the road. Honk, honk, went the horns on the speeding cars. Quack, went Mrs. Mallard as she tumbled back again. Quack, 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 went Jack, Cack, Lack, Mack, Knack, Whack, Pack, and Quack, just as loud as their little quackers could quack. The cars kept speeding by and honking, and Mrs. Mallard and the ducklings kept right on quack, quack, quacking. They made such a noise that Michael came running, waving his arms and blowing his whistle. He planted himself in the center of the road, raised one hand to stop the traffic, and then beckoned with the other, the way policemen do, for Mrs. Mallard to cross over. As soon as Mrs. Mallard and the ducklings were safe on the other side and on their way down Mount Vernon Street, Michael rushed back to his police booth. He called Clancy at headquarters and said, "There's a family of ducks walking down the street," Clancy said. "Family of what?" "Ducks," yelled Michael. "Send a police car quick." Meanwhile, Mrs. Mallard had reached the corner bookshop and turned onto Charles Street, with Jack, Cack, Lack, Mack, Knack, Whack, Pack, and Quack all marching in line behind her. Everyone stared. An old lady from Beacon Hill said, "Isn't it amazing?" The man who swept the street said, "Well, now ain't that nice?" And when Mrs. Mallard heard them, she was so proud, she tipped her nose in the air and walked along with an extra swing in her waddle. When she came to the corner of Beacon Street, there was the police car with 4 policemen that Clancy had sent from headquarters. The policemen held back the traffic so Mrs. Mallard and the ducklings could march across the street right into the public garden. Inside the gate, they all turned around to say thank you to the policeman. The policeman smiled and waved goodbye. When they reached the pond and swam across the little island, there was Mr. Mallard waiting for them, just as he had promised. The ducklings liked the new island so much that they decided to live there. All day long, they follow the swan boats and eat peanuts. And when night falls, they swim to their little island and go to sleep. You know, children, there's a bronze statue small statues of the ducklings and Mrs. Mallard that's right there in the public garden. Our next story is Petunia, written and illustrated by Roger Duvoisin, and it was originally published in 1950. In the meadow early one morning, Petunia, the silly goose, went strolling. She ate a bug here, clipped off a clover leaf there, and she picked at the dewdrops on the goldenrod leaves. Then suddenly she saw something she'd never seen before in the meadow. What was it? Petunia stole closer and closer and sniffed at it from all sides. "By goosey gander," she said, "it does not smell like food for a goose. But I believe I have seen a thing before. Yes, I have seen one under Bill's arm when he came out of school. It's a book. That's it, a book. Come to think of it, just the other day I heard Mr. Pumpkin telling Bill that books are very precious. He who owns books and loves them is wise." That's what he said. "He who owns books and loves them is wise," repeated Petunia to herself. And she thought as hard as and as long as she could. Well then, if I take this book with me and love it, I will be wise too. And no one will call me a silly goose ever again. So Petunia picked up the book and off she went with it. She slept with it, she swam with it, and knowing that she was so wise, Petunia also became proud and prouder and prouder, so proud that her neck stretched out several notches. It was King the Rooster who first noticed the change in Petunia. He said, "Maybe Petunia's not silly after all. She has a book, and she looks so wise that she must be so." And the other animals began to believe in Petunia's wisdom too. They asked her for advice and opinions, and Petunia was glad to help, even when she was not asked. So you see, children, you can't, well, you'll see soon about judging people from their appearance. Petunia grew still prouder, and her neck stretched out another notch. At the chicken coop, Ida the hen was cackling excitedly among her chicks. "Oh, Petunia," she said, "my chicks and I have been for a walk in the woods, and I think I've lost some of them. The farmer says that I had 9, but I can't count very well. Please, wise Petunia, count my chicks to see if they're all here." "Glad to help," said Petunia. "Let's see, 3 chicks at the fountain, 3 at the feeder, 3 about your legs. Now 3 times 3, that makes 6. 6? Asked Ida. 6? Well, is that less than 9? "Oh, that's more than 9, not less," said Petunia. "Lots more, my dear." "More than 9? Good gracious. As if I hadn't enough worries with my own 9 chicks. And now where do those other chicks come from? Oh, I'll never be happy again." Poor, worried Ida. But Petunia had other things to do. Beside the hedgerow, she met Straw the horse, who was in pain from a toothache. "Petunia," groaned Straw, "I'm dying. Surely with your wisdom you can stop this horrible pain." Glad to help, said Petunia. Open your mouth. Why, you poor straw, all these teeth. No wonder you have a toothache. Look at me. Do I have teeth? Of course not. So I have no toothache. I am going to stop that pain right now. I'm going to pull all those teeth out, all of them. Let me get some pliers. But Straw would not wait for the pliers. He was so afraid to lose his teeth that he never talked of his toothache to another soul. He suffered in silence. Poor, forlorn horse. But again, Petunia had other things to do. Cotton the kitten went up the tree, but could not come down. While he meowed and meowed, his friends called for Petunia. Glad to help, said Petunia. I know just what to do. Since none of you is tall enough to reach Cotton, all of you will do it together. Donkey on top of Clover, pig on top of donkey, and so on. Simple. So Donkey climbed up on Clover, pig on top of donkey, goat on top of pig, sheep on top of goat, piggy on top of sheep, turkey on top of piggy, duck on top of turkey, hen on top of duck. Suddenly Clover cried out, "Stop, my legs feel wobbly." And she sat. And Donkey and the rest fell into a heap, and Cotton was so scared that he fell on top of them. They were all full of bumps. Well, said Petunia, Cotton is down. So he was, poor bruised kitten. But Petunia had other things to do. Getting prouder all the time, she felt her neck stretch even further. So she doesn't seem to realize she's making mistakes. She now wandered down the meadow where she found other friends gathered around a box. Ah, wise Petunia, they shouted. We found this book in the ditch beside the road. Maybe it's food, Petunia. Tell us what the writing on it says. Glad to help, said Petunia. Now let's see. Candies. That's what it says on that box. Yes, candies. You may eat them. Yes, of course. Now, children, you'll see the illustration. No sooner had Petunia given the word than 7 greedy mouths tore up the box, grabbed the candies out of it, and boom! What a sight the animals were. Some were burned, some were bruised, some suffered in silence. That was Straw. Ida still worried about her chicks. All the barnyard was in trouble, and all because of Petunia. Petunia's pride and wisdom had exploded with the firecrackers. Her neck had shrunk back to its old size and was all bandaged up. She was the most downhearted of all, for she saw now that she was not a bit wise. But suddenly Petunia spied the book. The firecrackers had blown it open so that the pages showed. She had never seen them before. Now she saw that there was something written inside the book which she could not read. So she sat down and thought until at last she sighed, "Now I understand. It was not enough to carry wisdom under my wing. I must put it in my mind and in my heart. And to do that I must learn to read." Petunia was filled with joy. At once she began to work so that one day she could be truly wise. Then she would make her friends happy. Well, that's it, children. Thank you for watching The Story Place. I'm Anne Marie Battistone, and this is Norfolk Public Access. Don't miss the next one. Bye-bye.